Well, the motivation for this research really came from three observations. The first one is that firms commonly offer consumers contracts with a free allowance of units followed by steep penalties for going over. So you think about a typical cell phone contract. Until recent, now they're often unlimited talk and text, but until recently, have an allowance, say, of 500 included minutes, but pay 45 cents a minute if you go over. And now you still might get an allowance, say, 2 gigabytes of data a month and pay when you go over. But this isn't just cell phone contracts. It happens in a lot of places. Another example is your checking account. Typically, the transaction fee for swiping your debit card at Starbucks and getting a coffee is $0. That is until you run out of money in your account, and then it would be $35. That transaction fee, they call it an overdraft fee, or covering it when you're out of money. So that's the first observation. There's commonly these contracts with free units and then steep penalties. The second is often those penalties come as a surprise. When you get the bill in the mail, open up the envelope and say, 200 and what? Right? So people often don't realize they've crossed the threshold and started racking up those fees until the bill comes at the end of the month. So that's the second observation, is there's this surprise. And I should say that's something that people don't like. Something like 1 in 6 Americans has said they've experienced, there's a technical term for this, is bill shock. And something like 1 in 6 Americans say they've experienced this and they don't like it. The third observation is that this doesn't need to happen, right? It doesn't need to be a surprise. It could be that firms let you know and send you a little note saying, hey, it could be that when you walk up to Starbucks and you try to swipe your card, it tells the teller, overdraft fee applies. Continue, yes, no. And you could say, no, I don't want to pay $40 for my coffee. But banks choose not to set up the system that way. Similarly, your cell phone could start flashing red when, if an incoming call is going to lead to overage charges, it could flash red while it's ringing, so you know. And firms, until recently, haven't been providing alerts like that. Right? So there's these steep penalty fees. They surprise people, and it doesn't have to be. This is a conscious choice of firms not to warn people. And so those three observations led me to the question, well, would it be a good idea to require firms to send out alerts and warnings before, when those fees are about to add up? And this is something, it's not just my idea. So President Obama had this idea too. So I'm going to read you a quote from a statement he made in 2011. He said, "Far too many Americans know what it's like to open up their cell phone bill and be shocked by hundreds or even thousands of dollars in unexpected fees and charges. But we can put an end to that with a simple step. An alert warning consumers that they're about to hit their limit before fees and charges add up." And so, President Obama thought this might be a good idea. And really my motivation for the research is to think about that and think, ask the question, would that be a good idea? My goal in the research was really to go about finding an answer to this question. Would requiring firms to alert consumers before fees and penalties start adding up, would that be a good idea? And what do I mean by a good idea? I mean, would it actually benefit consumers? And you might think this is an obvious question. Yes, it sounds like it. You give consumers more information. Shouldn't they be able to make better decisions? But not so fast. It's not as obvious as all that, because while it's true these alerts might help consumers, not pay $40 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks, avoid running up big overage charges on their phone bill, firms are going to react too. It's not just consumers that are going to react. If you require firms to do these things and they start losing revenue on overdraft fees, they start losing revenue on overage fees, they're going to change their prices in other ways, trying to make up for that. And so to understand if the policy is going to be a good idea, you have to think through how firms are going to react, how firms are going to change their prices, and then work out whether the net effect is still going to be beneficial for consumers after you take into account all the ways firms are going to try to make back their money in other ways. I've approached this question from two different angles. So the first is from a theoretical perspective, and the second is from an empirical perspective. And so And the theoretical approach was to write down a theoretical model and try and ask in the abstract, how might firms set their prices? How would the requirement to send these alerts affect those decisions? And then the empirical approach, and I should say that in the theory approach is designed to be a sort of an abstract model that we could apply to many different situations. So we could apply to the cell phone case, we could apply to the checking account case. And as you might expect, one of the outputs of this theoretical approach is going to say, well, it depends. You know, the output of the theory model isn't an answer, yes, it's a good idea, or no, it's not. It says, well, yes, it's a good idea if all of these, circumstances are met, but maybe not otherwise. So the second approach is I've thought specifically about the cell phone market. And that's a particularly interesting case because this is a case where the FCC has actually implemented this policy. So as of the beginning of 2013, if you use up your allowance of minutes on your phone, you get a text message warning you. And that's not out of the goodness of Verizon's heart. That's because the FCC sort of twisted the arms of all the wireless firms together through their trade group, the CTIA. And they've now added a code of conduct, a bullet point to the end of their code of conduct that says that they will issue these alerts, sort of under the threat that if they didn't, the FCC was going to make them do it anyway. So I think it's particularly interesting to think, well, we've actually gone and implemented this policy. Is that a good idea? And so the sort of second prong in this approach to answering the question is to focus specifically on the cell phone market. And I went out and got data from people's cell phone bills to see how they're actually using their phones. And using that, tried to estimate a lot of different features of the market to say, well, we know that the policy could be good or bad in different situations, but what about in this market where we're actually implementing it? Is it a good idea there? So that's an overview of the approach. To give a little bit more detail and flesh out these two parts. So the theoretical approach really builds on a long literature on what's called nonlinear pricing. So I've mentioned already that these cell phone plans are complicated, right? You pay a monthly fee, then there's an allowance of minutes, then you pay overage fees. Complicated pricing like that is called, in the economics literature, is called nonlinear pricing. And so I used to be a graduate student at Stanford University, and one of the faculty members who was still there, who was actually the founder of the PhD program I was part of, was Bob Wilson, and he wrote the book on nonlinear pricing. And so I was following in his footsteps a little bit. In my dissertation was a dissertation about nonlinear pricing, and I was focusing on how firms write cell phone contracts. But one of the, to an outsider, somebody who's not, doing a PhD in this field, is maybe sounds surprising when I tell you, is that this whole thick book, right? And in fact, my dissertation as well makes it kind of an odd assumption, right? It makes the assumption that when a consumer is on a cell phone plan for a month, at the end of the month, you end up, having talked, say, 653 minutes. The assumption is not that this happened bit by bit over the month, but that one morning they woke up and said, aha, January, I'll talk for 653 minutes. I know that's 153 minutes over my limit. That's going to lead me, an overage charge of, $40 or whatever it is. That's what I'll do this month. That everything is sort of planned with perfect foresight. And then when February 1st rolls around, say, this month I'll talk 1,000 minutes. And right, of course, reality is totally different, right? If you end up talking 653 minutes, it's not because one decision was made to talk 653 minutes. It's because, day by day, the phone rang and you decided whether or not to answer it and how soon to hang up. And those small decisions added up bit by bit to 653 minutes. So, first, this is a dynamic process that led to that. And second, people don't keep track throughout the month. And sort of those two sort of important features were missing, from the whole literature on nonlinear pricing. And that's fine when nonlinear pricing is being applied to buying coffee at Starbucks, but not when it's being applied to cell phone pricing. So the sort of key methodological innovation was recognizing that when consumers talk on the phone, it's, a number of individual decisions on phone call by phone call that add up to a quantity choice. And the sort of real novelty in my work is that consumers might not know, might not keep track of past decisions. They might not keep track of how many calls they've already made. So that's so that was sort of the new thing in that approach. And I can say also a little bit more about the empirical approach. And so I said it said the answer depends. So what are some of the things it depends on? Well, for example, it depends on what we call a price elasticity. So if the price of talking on the phone goes up from 5 cents a minute to 10 cents a minute, do people talk less? Maybe not, right? If people are just making 911 calls, they don't care what the price is. They're going to make the same number of calls. But if these are calls of marginal importance, maybe going from 5 cents a minute to 10 cents a minute, they'll talk less. What's the, how much less would they talk when the price goes up? This matters a lot because all the alert does is let you know, hey, the price is 45 cents a minute. If people are going to keep on talking regardless, then the policy is going to have no effect at all. So one of the things I needed to know is how much, how responsive are people going to be to an increase in the price? One of the other things we needed to know is, how good a job are people doing at picking the right cell phone plan? Because these overages are so expensive. It turns out if you were doing a great job picking a plan, you'd be on a really big plan with a lot of included minutes or a lot of included data and never have an overage and never need to get one of these alerts. These are only going to be really helpful if people are actually not making great plan choices and sometimes are on too small a plan and are getting hit with these overages quite a lot of the time. And so that's one of the things that the empirical work shows, that actually people do a pretty lousy job at picking a cell phone plan. And so these alerts actually have the potential to make a big difference. So it turns out there were some surprises. And so let me focus on the empirical work that was looking specifically at the cell phone case. Now, I should say that there's a caveat to what I'm about to say, is that I started working on this project before that. So the policy went into effect in 2013. So I started working on this before then. I was trying to predict the effect of the policy, not measure what actually happened, but try and predict what the effect of the policy would be. And I was using a data that's a bit old now, sort of data from 2002 to 2004, and that's back when people talked on their phones, before it was all about Facebook on the phone. So in some sense, you could interpret my result as a prediction about what would have happened if we'd implemented the policy back in 2004, and not how it's actually working out now. But nonetheless, the prediction is that the policy actually wouldn't help consumers on average. It might make them, if anything, slightly worse off on average. And so we thought that was a little bit surprising, because the basic intuition is these alerts should help consumers. And it's true, they do help some people. So some people would have had big overage fees, but the model predicts that with the alert, they'd cut back their calling and have a much lower bill and be much better off. But there's a lot of people who were never going to be over anyway, never going to get the alert anyway. And because the firm's trying to make up revenue, predict that they're going to raise monthly fees, do other things to raise revenue. And so a lot of people don't benefit from the alert and are paying higher monthly fees. And it turns out, so we predict that firms we're going to manage to make about as much money with the regulation in effect as without. And some people are going to save money. Some people are going to pay more. That's going to about balance out. But on the whole, people are going to get to make fewer phone calls or use less data. And part of that should be intuitive. What do you do when you get the alert? Well, you stop talking. So people are going to stop talking sooner than before and talk less on the phone, get less value from the service, but the firm's still going to manage to change all the fees to extract the same amount of money. So people don't save any money, but end up talking less. So on average, they're all a little bit worse off. Although the good thing is it cuts back on the really high bills. So to the extent that it's particularly nasty to get a shockingly high bill, we predicted that should be more of a thing of the past with the new policy. But yeah, so what's surprising is that the possibility that actually people could be made worse off by this. One of the reasons that it turned out that we predict that consumers would be made worse off is the underlying reason for it is it turns out we predict that consumers undervalue the alerts. And the reason is one of the things we do in the model is we estimate people's expectations about how much they're going to use the phone, right? Because that's important for determining what plan you pick, right? So one would hope that people who talk on the phone a lot realize that up front and pick a big plan. But we can infer from the fact that a lot of people who talk a lot actually choose a small plan that they're guessing wrong. They don't realize they're going to talk that much. And because of that mistake, they also don't realize how useful these bill shock alerts are going to be. Because they sort of think, oh yeah, but that's only for people who picked too small a plan and run into these overages. I've picked a good plan. I'm not going to have them. And so consumers undervalue these alerts. So one of the lessons would be, actually, these alerts are, potentially more valuable than you realize. There are policy implications to the research, particularly, for the case of the FCC's bill shock policy. So one implication is the regulation is not going to be as beneficial as you would have thought if you don't take into account firms' price changes. So, we did one prediction where we predicted the effect of the policies, assuming firms hold their prices fixed. Then it looks great for everybody. But we get this result that consumers are not helped, maybe even slightly hurt when we take into account the price changes. So I think an important lesson for policymakers is you have to think ahead to how firms are going to react and take that into account. And in general, any possible policy intervention is going to be less helpful when you take into account firms' response, the way firms try and work around it. Well, I'm still interested in this area, and I've said that we've looked specifically at the case of cell phones, and we suggest that maybe the policy is not very helpful there. I think in the case of retail banking and checking accounts, there's actually a lot more potential for the policy to be helpful there. I suspect that banks will have a smaller ability to just raise monthly fees to offset any losses they make from fewer overdraft fees if people manage their cash flow better. So I think policy of providing low balance alerts to consumers has a greater potential to benefit consumers in that market. And this is something conceivably the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau could require that banks provide low balance alerts. Certainly in the UK, the financial, the regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority have struck a deal with the major banks there that they all offer low balance alerts as an option, although people aren't defaulted in. We might consider doing something even stronger in the US, like requiring that by default people get low balance alerts and they can opt out if they want. So one of the things I'm doing now is looking at the banking transactions by consumers who get low balance alerts from a third party other than their bank, and trying to see how effective those alerts are at helping them better manage their cash flow and avoid overdraft fees. I think the obvious way I use the library every day and all the research projects I'm working on and the non-research stuff I'm doing as well is giving me access to the to journal articles and online databases. And then, of course, I also find it really convenient that when there's something that's not online, I can fill out the request and get a Xerox copy of it or a scanned copy in my inbox in just a few days, whether it's a book chapter or just a journal that wasn't in the online database. And then I should say also, I started both of these projects when I was still at MIT. And one of the things the librarians did for me there was help me find annual reports for some of the cell phone companies to sort of check some of the numbers that I was coming up in my model. The other thing I'd just like to mention that here at BC, the research computing services have been a terrific support. All the analysis of the cell phone empirical paper was done on the Pleiades Linux cluster, which is sort of essential to what I do. So. I didn't set out to be an economist. I set out to be an engineer and an entrepreneur. When I went to as a freshman, I went to Penn and was going to do a joint degree in engineering and business, but as part of my business course, I had to take Econ 101 fall semester freshman year, and I had a terrific teacher, Dr. Bill Whitney, who I ended up keeping in touch with throughout my 4 years as an undergraduate. And I think it was that first class that set me off to do a master's in economics at Oxford, and I just got hooked from there. So.